So if you're not already depressed by the news, try reading Ecclesiastes. To be sure, it contains some gems of wisdom, particularly if we consider its context amidst the bitter disappointment of post-exilic Jerusalem. But its refrain is this: all is vanity, all is vanity, all is in vain. The teacher asserts that our good deeds will accomplish nothing, our efforts to find meaning are pointless, and we're all going to die. But what about chapter 3, you might say? You know, for everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Surely there is something worthy about those words, but of course those of us of a certain age will hear those words with the musical overlay of Pete Seeger or the Byrds, and that's why we think we hear something worthy in that third chapter. But when you read even those words in their context, they say, yeah, you know, there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time for this and a time for that. But really, what's the point? How did this book ever get into the Bible? The general thrust of Scripture is that there is meaning and purpose in life. History is moving toward the fullness of God's kingdom, and our good works are contributing to that effort. Where Ecclesiastes sees nothing but vanity, the other 64 books of the Bible point to eternal verities, from the Latin veritas, meaning truth. Eternal verities, such as doing justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. If our lives are guided by these ultimate norms, then we will accomplish something of God's grand design for creation. That's what Micah and Amos and Isaiah and Paul and all of those speaking for the majority in the Bible are suggesting, with Jesus writing the opinion for the majority. So which is it? Verity or vanity? Our bias is to go with the overall worldview of Scripture and just kind of blip over Ecclesiastes, except, maybe for chapter 3. But biblical scholars such as Walter Brueggemann and Phyllis Tribble tell us that that's not legit. We can't just embrace those parts of Scripture that sound a little bit like Jesus and ignore the rest. We have to wrestle, these scholars tell us, we have to wrestle with the whole Bible. Well, perhaps we can say at least this about Ecclesiastes. Maybe it's a lament. When we look around at the world, it seems like our good works are in vain. When we've worked hard for voting rights, only to see those gains mostly erased after 60 years, it seems like life is vanity. When innocent people are gunned down with AR-15s and it feels like we can do nothing to stop the slaughter, it seems like life is vanity. When the earth is afflicted with killer floods and scorching heat, even after 50 years of hard work and environmental awareness, it seems like life is vanity. Faced with the appearance that our efforts are in vain, we have two options. We can make life a game, or we can make life a story. That's the wisdom that David Brooks suggests in a recent New York Times article, and you see, this is what you get to do in retirement. You get to sit around all day and read the New York Times. Game or story? This is the suggestion of a scholar that actually Brooks is quoting. If you think that a purpose-filled life, a life of virtue that is guided by ultimate norms, if you think that such a life really is pointless, then you turn life into a game in which you seek as much status or wealth or power as you can accumulate. And this, in fact, interestingly enough, is the strategy that the teacher advocates. He says in chapter 3, eat, drink, and take pleasure in your life. This is the strategy, of course, that the rich and powerful in Jerusalem pursued. This is the strategy by which 1% of the world's population controls nearly 50% of the world's wealth. In other words, the game works. If you play the game well enough, if you lack a moral compass, if you can con people into giving you what you want and making them think that it's what they need. The only virtue in this game is winning. And when winning is a virtue and losing is a sin, then cheating becomes a sacrament. But you know, most people aren't this cynical. They think that life really does have meaning and purpose. They think, I dare say, we think that our efforts to do good really do count for something. But with so little evidence that a life of virtue is worth pursuing, we overlay a story on the evidence in order to find the virtue. It's kind of like, you know, those secret code glasses that some of us remember getting as kids. You sent in the 2 cereal box tops, and in the mail you got those funny glasses with the tinted lenses, and you put them on and you read the message, and you found the secret text within that message. We humans use stories kind of in this way. We use stories as an overlay on the text of daily life. And that's how we find eternal verities hidden amidst earthly vanities. That's how we find our purpose and our joy. But which story? Which story should we choose? Which story should we tell? Which story should we use as the overlay by which we can find that meaning and purpose? Of course, there are numbers. The numbers of those stories are legion. Well, maybe a story, maybe the biblical story, or a story that's been influenced by the Bible. And in fact, there are a bunch of stories, life stories, worldview stories out there that are at least informed by the biblical story. There is, for example, what one might call the progressive story. Here, the eternal verity is justice. The progressive story says that the nation can make progress toward social and environmental justice by giving the federal government substantial regulatory powers. According to this story, highly trained civil servants, that is to say, objective experts, will use their regulatory authority to thwart big business, redistribute wealth, and develop renewable energy. The purpose of history is to strive toward justice, says this story, especially through legislation and regulation. That's one possible story. There's another one that's called, we might call it the paternal story. The name derives from the founding fathers, forgetting, of course, that there were also founding mothers like Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. Here, the eternal verity is truth. The paternal story claims that all you have to do is to discern the true meaning of the words of the founding fathers as found especially in the Constitution, and then live our lives freely within the guardrails that this one and only true interpretation of the words of the founding fathers provides. The purpose of history is to strive toward freedom, and the truth of the founders will guide the way. And then there's, we might say, the populist story. Here, the eternal verity is faith. The populist story says that a particular form of faith, namely white evangelical Christianity, is the true foundation of the nation. And we just have to put God back into everything. The purpose of history is for everyone to believe in Jesus, and then we'll all go to heaven and everything will be fine. In the meantime, says this story, the government should impose this particular vision of faith on everyone who does not believe, and then everything's going to be even better. So, truth, justice, truth, and faith, of course, these are eternal verities. These are eternal realities. Verily, I say unto you, Jesus says, and then he tells a story about justice or truth or faith. But here's the problem. Inevitably, sinful human being that I am, inevitably, I think my story has more virtue than it really does. And certainly my story has more virtue than your story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to impose my story on you and everyone else. I'm going to try to impose my story on the whole of history. Reinhold Niebuhr identifies this as the sin of pride, especially pride of virtue and pride of power. Even the teacher says, there is no one on earth so righteous as to do good without sinning. Well, the sin of the progressive story is, and I should say, one can find elements of truth in all of these stories. Again, they're informed by the biblical story, so there are elements of truth in all of these stories, but also elements of sin. The sin of the progressive story is to assume that expert training overcomes the blinders of ignorance and self-righteousness. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Progressive urban planners crafted zoning laws that prevent us from building the quantity and the diversity of housing that we need to end homelessness. And regulations that tempered the greed of the railroad circa 1900, that was a good thing, nearly killed the railroads circa 1960. Not so good. Progressives, in their arrogance, fail to recognize their short-sightedness. The sin of the paternal story is to assume that only 21st century minds of a certain libertarian bent can discern the meaning of 18th and 19th century texts. Then they compound the sin by failing to do the historical research that would give them some sense of the context out of which those texts emerged. You can't understand a text without the context. The result is that somehow, in the name of ordered liberty, the tellers of the paternal story allow state legislatures to put strict orders on women's bodies and almost limitless liberty on the ownership of guns. Not a whole lot of order here, not a whole lot of liberty here. Now, ordered liberty is a good thing. It reflects the creative tension in Christian tradition between the individual and the community. But if lurching from one extreme to the other is an example of ordered liberty, then there's something to be said for the fellow who, with his feet in the fire and his head in the freezer, is on average comfortable. The sin of the populist story is to read their vision of faith back into history, where in fact it's not there. Put God back in the Constitution? God was never in the Constitution. And the God who appears in the Declaration of Independence is a semi-deistic God of nature, not the biblical God whose word became flesh in Jesus Christ. In fact, we do need to overlay a story upon the raw data of history in order to find meaning and direction and joy in life. But in so doing, we need to use the entire biblical story, not some truncated version thereof. We need to draw upon the full sweep of the narrative from Genesis to Revelation, not take a premature solace in some rigid ideology that cherry picks the narrative according to our own self-interest and preconceived notions. Now, if we look only at the raw data, if we look only at things that are on earth, as Colossians puts it, then we're stuck with the notion, indeed, that all is vanity, and with the teacher, we will give up our hearts to despair. But here's the good news. Here is the good news. We have been raised with Christ. We are called to seek the things that are above where Christ is, not to set our minds on the seemingly vain earthly things that we see around us. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at the world. By no means. Of course, we need to look at the world. The biblical writers were keen observers of the events around them, but we are called to observe these apparent vanities through the lenses of eternal verities. The Bible doesn't shy away from the evidence that our work is in vain. That's what the cross is all about. A life of infinite virtue is snuffed out in an act of unspeakable violence. Talk about vanity. But, as Helen reminded us last week, the story is not finished. The teacher may see the future disappearing into a black hole from which no life can emerge, but we have the promise of resurrection in Jesus Christ. And in fact, the teacher helps us get there. His world-weary observations invite us to lift our eyes above the weary world and place our trust in the inscrutability of God. The teacher overturns all notions of human certainty and points us toward the promises of the Eternal One. Maybe that's why Ecclesiastes is in the Bible. Trust not in the idolatry of some game or story. We look to the Christ in all of his glory. Seek the things that are above where Christ is, Colossians says, seated at the right hand of God. And when the dead are raised and Christ is revealed in all of his fullness, then all of the good that you or I or anyone else has ever done in history will be revealed with Christ in glory. That's where history is headed, toward that point where death is swallowed up in victory. And when we view the world from that perspective, we realize with St. Paul that our labor is not in vain. In the meantime, we must be careful not to slap our own narrative upon the events around us. Much of life will always seem pointless and absurd. To walk by faith as the Bible understands faith is to trust in the one whose eternal verities are fully revealed beyond this world and mostly veiled in this world. To walk in such faith is to listen to the biblical story in its fullness while embracing certain safeguards such as the rule of law, the balance of power, and the disestablishment of religion, safeguards that guard against those who want to play their games or impose their stories upon the rest of us. These are safeguards put in place by the founders, trusting in the wisdom of providence if we can just guard against the worst excesses of human sinfulness. One of the ironies of Ecclesiastes is that occasionally, amidst this otherwise depressing book, there are calls to fill one's life with joy. With joy. This book that seems to be so depressing, he manages to slip in some references to joy. It's hard to be joyful if you are zealously imposing your story upon the lives of others and upon history and making everyone else's life miserable. But the biblical story in its fullness has so much joy. In a rare moment when even the teacher sees through the fog of vanity, he says, "To the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and, yes, joy." And what is pleasing to the Holy One? It is when God's people do justly and love mercy and especially walk humbly, trusting not in their own earthly judgments, but in God's transcendent wisdom. And this is the word of the Lord.